Hello, and welcome to the Argyle SMB Accounting Forum. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, David Levi, Senior Vice President Controller, Principal Accounting Officer, Vonage. We are excited to have David with us for a keynote presentation titled Cloud-Based Accounting for SMBs. Welcome, David. Over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. Another great session on kind of what's going on in the marketplace today for financial accountants. It's a risky time. A lot going on. A lot of companies are considering what to do and whether or not they should go cloud or stay on-prem, or ultimately decide if they should beef up their systems and their infrastructure and their controls. Costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time, and ultimately has a lot of risks. But the benefits, in my view, far outweigh the potential risks of what it takes to get this done. If you're not on the cloud today, you're sitting in an on-prem system where you've got in-house IT infrastructure managing all the processes, all the changes, all the updates. You probably are sitting there with a significant level of customization, where every department decides what they want their report to look like, and every department makes requests for changes, and seems like there's a lot of turmoil and change. And every time a new report, a new system process is established, that creates another avenue for concerns. Close happens and something goes awry. Some report doesn't work again because some change occurred in the system. This is what's been going on for many, many years. I would say over the last 5 to 10, the idea of the cloud has really entered the arena and really made a big difference in the financial controllers' environment, increasing controls and involving a great deal of work to get it there. But ultimately, when it's there, it is a place where certainly financial controls would want to be. It is a sell. You have to sell it to the senior leadership. You have to sell it to the board, the audit committee, and the auditors. And ultimately, everyone should want to go that way for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, efficiencies, process, consistency, and secondly, I would say control and security. It creates this environment that is look, nothing's ironclad, but when you have an outsourced provider essentially managing your ERP from the cloud, it does a lot of things for you. It gives you that environment that's more secure. It gives you that environment that is ultimately more consistent. And it gives you that environment that you can access from anywhere in the world at any point in time, and likely have a very strong experience in doing so. The negatives go in a lot of different directions. However, one of the big negatives is customization. You're not going to be able to customize that system like you did when it was on-prem. You're not going to be able to create all these set reporting structures within an application that is automatic. However, there is customization that can be built on top of that, either through a data warehouse or through other applications that will sit on top where data is provided. You can do it in a way that's also on the cloud and has the same level of restrictions and controls, and ultimately give you that customization you need. And in fact, you can distribute the requirements out to the field, and people in the finance team can grab data and do a lot of things. We used to do this years ago in Hyperion and Essbase and all those kinds of things. Those programs, those type of programs exist today, and you can continue to grab data in a way that's actually quite safe, quite controlled. It'll take some training and all those things, but all of this has to be built, and it does take time. So again, if you're on-prem today and you've been working on a system that's been out there for a long time, it can take as much as a year or longer, depending on who you bring in and how integrated your ERP is to your other systems, your other subledgers, and is it all one integrated system? What about your fixed assets, your order to cash systems, your accounts payable, payroll? All these things can be different systems and different applications that would somehow have to be integrated. Obviously, the best solution is to install and integrate all of the things that come with the ERP. What we all know that isn't always possible, especially if HR wants a different payroll system, or if you've already got a PO system that's embedded in your environment and you want to continue that process. The other thing is sometimes you outsource some of these things. AP could be outsourced to an operation that has their own applications, and then you want these things integrated. So a lot to consider. So let's unpack some of this, some of these concepts, and just think about whether or not it's the right thing for you. So in your decision-making process, one of the important things is to really poll the company, the whole company, and not just the finance organization. Everyone's going to be impacted by an installation of a cloud environment, better or worse. Some cases they'll get more information. In other cases, they might get less information. In other cases, they may be more impacted. In other cases, they could be less impacted. So again, you do want to have a really robust survey, really robust engagement with the entire organization. And when I say the entire organization, I mean at the board level, audit committee, senior levels, marketing, HR, legal, all of the business operations, your revenue operations, billing, credit, collections. All of these people, everybody that operates in and around these systems could and likely will be impacted by the decision to go to the cloud. The likelihood is in the long run, they will be better off, but in the short run, there's going to be disruption, there's going to be potential delays, there's going to be potential issues for them. There's also a significant amount of money, significant amount of effort and time that is devoted to getting your systems and applications up and running. So there's a poll question that's going to come up soon. I'm not sure. I don't think we're going to see it here, but ultimately the poll question is going to ask you whether or not you are in an environment. And I'll just read it for you. It'll say, please indicate the extent to which you agree the following statement: our finance team is currently focused on cloud-based accounting to streamline traditional processes. And then there's a level of agreement or disagreement as to whether or not you believe that that's true. Depending on the size of your organization, and this is supposed to be an SMB type presentation. So if you're really small, you're probably sitting there with a QuickBooks, or maybe if you're in intermediate size company, you might even be on NetSuite. But you're likely not on SAP. You're likely not on maybe even Oracle Fusion, which is a cloud-based system as well. And there are others. I don't want to say those are the only two, but those are generally the go-tos for some of the larger companies. So in my decision-making process, after polling the entire organization and getting a really good sense for the appetite to enter into this kind of a project, again, quite significant in terms of the funding and the buy-in, and ultimately the need and the effort necessary to kind of get your organization from on-prem or even old systems, even if they are sort of online, to the new cloud and integrated environment. I walked into an organization just where I am today, where we had no choice but to do that. The systems were quite archaic and needed to be updated and upgraded, and it took quite a bit of negotiation and influencing all levels of management to ensure that the funding was there. And ultimately, the concern was that the existing environment would not sustain itself, was not going to be in a place that really would serve the company in a way that it needed to be. And ultimately, if the growth is there and the continuing complexity is there, and ultimately you've got new leaders coming in expecting a certain level of service, a certain level of timing. I mean, we've got it now. Revenue is day one and earnings are day three. It's very hard to navigate that I mean, we'll talk a little bit about remote working. If your company is hybrid or remote and you're not on the cloud, it's almost I mean, it's impossible. I mean, there's going to be a number of a good number of people from the IT organization or finance organization that will need to be on-prem to be able to manage an archaic, old, or even online system that isn't fully on the cloud and serviced by a third-party provider. So in any event, the process for making those decisions can be complex, can take some time, but ultimately I bring it down to a fairly easy consideration. If you are small enough where a QuickBooks or even a NetSuite can accomplish your tasks, meaning you don't have a very complex legal entity system or environment, you don't have a very complex customer service engagement that requires integration into your ERP. So we have the results of the survey, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if you have the ability to make the decisions around, going with a completely integrated, smaller, fully operational turnkey system, that is great, and it'll do well for a time. And if you're in growth mode, if you're in acquisition mode, if you're in many countries and you're growing in leaps and bounds, you likely will need to expand from QuickBooks and that kind of a system. That works well. It's fine as long as you're not legal entity complex and globally footprinted. It would work well. But as you grow and as you have more legal entities and more country-based operations, you're going to see that you're going to need to continue to think about, what other functions you're going to need. Then you move into the NetSuites, and then you go into the full ERP, Oracle, and maybe SAP and others that are out there. So let's just talk about the survey. The survey came back and basically said agree. About half said agree that they are at some level considering and in the process of thinking about the cloud. The other half, not so much. And again, depending on your size and available resources and kind of where you are in your evolution, it's not unexpected. So definitely give that some thought as you go through your process. For those of you that are not thinking about it, you're shortchanging the potential risks in the future, not being able to manage the growth and the timing that is going to be necessary. Again, if you're bringing in acquisitions, if you're bringing in that need to be loaded into these systems, if you're complex legal entities, complex tax structures, and complex intercompanies around the world, and you're looking to integrate and link into your programs that are customer facing, including billing and credit and collections, and you want to have add-on applications, very difficult to do in the old applications or in a closed system like QuickBooks. So definitely want to give the thought to what it would take, bring in a consultant to just give you some idea. They typically will do that for free, and they'll give you an assessment and give you a sense of whether or not you are in the right position to be able to move forward. So let's unpack some of the risks, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the benefits as we go, but the risks and concerns that a non-cloud system will provide, rather than a cloud system will have for you. So again, it's the opportunity for being able to expand around the world, with access to all of the applications very easily, and not worry about where people are in the world. I mean, as we grow remotely, I can tell you my whole organization is remote. A few years back, never would have thought that was even possible. And today we don't think twice about finance being remote. In fact, even our outsourcers are remote. If you're using Accenture or Genpact or many of these outsourcers that are out there, a lot of their teams are actually remote, working from home too. So if you're thinking about using third-party providers and you're not on the cloud, that would make it really difficult. And there's a lot of benefits in outsourcing too. I mean, you're saving money, you're getting more consistency. These guys are in the market every day. So as they lose people, they're hiring people. So there's a lot of benefits in going with an outsourcer. And if you're not on the cloud, it makes it almost impossible, given the remoteness of both that operation in terms of what countries they're in, and then two, the fact that even they are working from home largely today. And I don't know if that's going to change much. I mean, I think there's some push, especially in the banking industry, the banking and overall the banking industry, the financial institutions. They are trying to bring their people back in, and to some extent, they're somewhat successful in that. But I think outside of that industry, I think you're seeing a lot of continued hybrid working, and if you're not on the cloud, that makes that very, very difficult to manage. By the way, just let me just note, if someone has any questions, there's no need to wait till the end. I'd like to address questions as I go. So if somebody has a thought or a question, or ultimately something they'd like to make an argument about, send your questions in to the team here, and they'll show me the questions, and I'll address them as we go. So please don't be shy. Let's go through this. This is meant to be interactive. This is meant to be as open as possible in terms of the topics and the issues that you may or may not be experiencing. Hopefully, I'm touching on some of the things that maybe you haven't thought about, or even if you have, not really sure what those risks, benefits, and concerns are. So we're going to go through that as we continue to talk about it. So what are the benefits? Again, the benefits, as we said, are certainly accessibility, certainly the control environment, certainly the consistency, and certainly the ability to outsource and be able to operate globally with third-party providers. So because of those benefits, many companies either have or are considering going to the cloud. So one of the biggest benefits after you do that is that you're able to eliminate the IT infrastructure. So when I say IT infrastructure, what are we talking about? We're talking about engineers, we're talking about hardware, software, we're talking about maintenance, we're talking about patches, we're talking about all the things that an entire IT organization needs to manage every day, and that goes wrong and goes down and has issues. So that's not to say the outside providers don't have those issues as well. They do, and it does happen, but they're somewhat seldom, and they're well controlled, and they're fairly quick in terms of their addressing. So it is one of the biggest benefits and the biggest cost savers. Again, being able to outsource your finance, your low-level finance operation, and to the ability to eliminate that infrastructure that costs money and is ultimately not the most efficient. Generally, your IT organization is not expert in those ERP systems, and it creates an environment that is somewhat volatile. And as you grow and as you acquire and as you get more complex, it makes it very difficult to continue your pace and the timing and the amount of detail that you need to provide. So let's just cover one of the questions that are coming up. It says, are there any extra precautions that should be taken to ensure data is protected and to mitigate any potential risk? So what is that asking? So at the end of the day, data is sacrosanct. Where does the data live? The data lives on the cloud. And is the cloud a risky place to be? I would say the cloud is a risky place to be, but no more risky, I would say, than the database you've got in your facility somewhere in the world that can be hacked and that can be accessed through nefarious means anywhere. The difference is these operators, these third-party operators that host these applications, are in the business of managing risk and managing data that is not accessible to the world. They have the state-of-the-art operation. They manage those risks in a way that, quite frankly, very few companies can. So a lot of companies use, for instance, Amazon as a database. So if you're doing your data warehouse or you're managing all your platforms on that database, their operations are about as cyber tight as you could ever get. I would challenge any smaller or even mid-sized company to think that they could manage that risk any better than an Amazon or Oracle or SAP or anybody else. So that if you outsource your data to a reputable hosting operation, that data, look, nothing's guaranteed and nothing is 100%, but it's pretty safe. So in any event, that is a huge benefit in being able to eliminate that infrastructure. And obviously the cyber benefits, as we just discussed, are also equally a huge benefit in being able to go to the clouds. And then of course the accessibility. The other thing, and it almost sounds like it's the same thing, but it really isn't when you talk about centralization, especially if you're in an acquisition mode where you're bringing in all these companies that are bringing to the table their own ERPs and their own processes and their own, or you've got a lot of subsidiaries that have been built over time where they're managing their process the same differently, or they have very different systems or different processes or different controls even. You know, when you want to think about an environment that is at the highest level of efficiency, effectiveness, and control, it is those environments that are centralized. So when you have the least amount of systems, the least amount of controls, and the least amount of leaks in terms of what's possible that could go wrong, that is the environment you want to be on. And if you're going to move a lot of companies, subsidiaries, and acquisitions to a centralized operation, the best place to do it is in the cloud, because the ability to do so is already embedded in the process. You have help in being able to expand. You have help in the ability to manage the infrastructure, and then ultimately get a brand new set of reporting that is consistent and not as customized, which is in a lot of cases, it's those customizations that create the disruptions, the downs, the downtime, the inability to understand controls and reconciliations, because you've got all this customization in place. You never know, and if you don't do the right level of regression analysis every time you take a patch and update it and upgrade it, you don't really know. I mean, even if you're being hosted, you need to do that. As the hosting companies update and patch and do those things, you need to do regression analysis yourself and run everything through everything you have. And so the ability to have customization becomes less and less and less. So even if you're hosted, you don't want all those reports that are attached. You don't want to have an entire environment of Excel and macros that sit on top of these systems, because that just creates, you're always going to be one circular reference away from a material weakness. I mean, you just never know what could happen. All right, let's cover another question that came in. This is, beyond just accounting, how does the cloud positively impact company-wide operations? So I mean, the obvious answer is access. So if you think about how does the rest of the organization get impacted by a cloud-based upgrade, just think about a simple process of ordering something. So you've got POs. If you've got an internal on-prem system that's very difficult to navigate, it's you don't have consistent data codes, you don't have consistent processes, you don't have consistent access, just the ability to get everybody, because theoretically anybody in the company can order something or buy something, at least through a channel. And if your process is inconsistent, it makes it impossible. Your vendor experience internally is going to be very difficult. And if that's an area you manage, you're going to get a lot of customer complaints. You're going to get your internal environment really complaining about that. So just the PO process alone makes being on the cloud worth it. And I've always started ERP systems and processes and upgrades in the AP department, because the PO process is so important and so fundamentally so fundamental to a strong control environment, because it impacts everything along the way. if you don't have POs, you don't have controls, you don't have approval processes, you don't have an environment where everybody's being or is ordering things in a way that's consistent and well controlled. You need to start with the PO process. And in a lot of companies, the smaller companies that I've been where they didn't have POs at all, it was wild, wild west. Invoices would just show up, and you didn't know who it was for, you didn't know what it was for, you didn't know how to process it, you didn't know if it was already accrued, and you didn't know anything. So POs are very, very important. I know in the smaller companies, they tend to not use POs. And I'm telling you, if you don't start when you're small, it's very difficult to get it in when you're larger. So get that mentality in place today, and get those PO systems and processes in place. The best place to do that is on the cloud, where everyone can access it. And then you have other impacts. So your auditors coming in and want access to your systems. It's sometimes difficult for them to access internal on-prem systems where they can't access it remotely, and they can't access it in a way that is beneficial for them because they need full data. And these outsourcers, these hosted outsourced companies are used to being able to provide access to auditors so that they can plug in their data. I mean, a lot of auditors today, they walk in, plug into your system, grab all the data, and do all of their analysis on their own applications. Very difficult to do that, and assume 100% control over that transfer of data if it's not a hosted on-prem, a hosted on-cloud application. Third question here, what criteria should finance leaders consider when evaluating third-party outsourcers? Are there any red flags that you can comment on? What's interesting is a lot of these third-party hosting providers actually don't do the installations themselves. They provide the information, they provide maintenance and support, but they won't actually come out and do the installation for you. So you generally have to hire a third-party provider, at the highest levels, PwC, the big four, and you've got a lot of integrators that do that, even at those levels in terms of high-based companies. But there are many installation providers, even at the lower echelons, that can provide these installation projects for you. And they know how to work with the hosting system. So how do you decide? Again, it's a difficult thing. And like anything else, when you're thinking about a vendor, the relationship has to start with trust. You have to get into a point where you feel comfortable that they're going to tell you the right things, even if you don't want to hear it. You want to get into a relationship with a third-party provider, especially for installation for an ERP, because if you can't trust them, if they're not going to be honest about, they're just going to go ahead and do their own thing, and at the end of the day, you're not going to get what you want and need. Nobody benefits. They'll get a bad reputation, and then you'll have a lot of money that you spent that doesn't give you what you need. So again, it comes down to trust, and it comes down to setting your own criteria in terms of what is it that you want. How do you want to do it? How long do you have? How much is your budget? And then ultimately, what are the controls? What is the environment you want to live in? So those criteria are something you need to think about way in advance. And then once you have those, you interview maybe 3 or 4. Don't go crazy and start making it 10 or 15. You will lose focus and ultimately not get to the right place. Have your procurement team or whoever your procurement leader is think about the best 3 or 4 providers for you to consider an interview, and then ultimately think about the level of service they have. If they have a lot of installations that they've done, that's great. If they've done a lot and do a lot, do they have the resources to take you on if you're a smaller company, and can they service you? Maybe you need a lot more hand-holding than some of the bigger companies do because they have IT infrastructures and you don't, so you might need more hand-holding. Excuse me. So it's trust. Is it the right level of hand-holding, and then ultimately, do they have the resources to really service you the way you want? And then I would say, for again, your criteria, you got to think, well, logically, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Think about your PO environment. Think about your control, your journal entries, account recs. How is that going to work? Think about how all of that is going to be integrated, including order to cash, into your ERP. And then you got to think about the budgeting, the forecasting, the modeling side afterwards. If you don't have a data warehouse, are you going to look for the CRP to do those things? And so all of this being done on-prem makes it really difficult to engage the entire organization in a way that makes sense. Access to an on-prem system is very difficult and risky. And so it really provides a significant amount of benefits in going live on an online, in the cloud application. Yeah, we can continue on with some of the benefits and concerns, but let's go to polling number 2. There was a second polling question. What are the main benefits of cloud-based accounting for your organization, if any? Please select. So this is a lot of what we've been talking about. So let's see what people have been saying. So it's a bit spread, almost equally. So if we think about, almost a quarter, and a quarter. Secure method of storing data. A lot of people are thinking that that's one of the biggest benefits of cloud. It is a benefit. I wouldn't say the biggest. I think all of these things do make sense and do provide benefits. The second one was easy access to confidential information from any location. Yes, true, of course, but you also want that secure. So just accessing it isn't good enough. It needs to be accessible globally in a hybrid or remote environment, but it also has to be just equally as secure. So while some people said that security was the most important thing, others said that access was the most important thing. Both are equally important. Streamlining processes. That's an interesting one. Again, equal in terms of the audience's thoughts around why go on cloud or in the cloud. Again, streamlining processes isn't necessarily an on cloud or in cloud thought process. That's something you need to think about regardless of your environment. How do we do things in the most efficient way? Most times, the most efficient way is less systems, less processes, less customization, less people touching data. In my view, it just happens to be that kind of an environment looks a lot like an in the cloud hosted application. When you're on-prem, and it's a legacy system that have been built up over time, and you've got a lot of people that have had their hands in it, adding customization, adding new reports and infrastructure, and adding new controls embedded into it. It's very difficult to go from that to a very streamlined process in that same on-prem system. You don't have some of the out of the box, on the shelf functionality that does come with these new online applications, despite the fact that they're not as customizable. They have a lot of things that are built in that you can decide up front to have that will allow for streamlined processes. Where are most of the hurdles in systems, processes, and applications? A lot of it is in how the AP system works, and ultimately how the reporting system works. So, your coding process, your legal entity structure, and then also your taxing, ability, and then then number 2, ultimately how you're set up, but most importantly how you access it. So, streamlined operation has to be done at the lowest level. What is the output, and then what is the best way to get to that output? A lot of times there's a lot of Excel embedded in that process. There's a lot of macros that are embedded in that process. Excel is great. It's fantastic. And it's wonderful for analysis. But if it is a control, if it's how you actually get a number done, and then you manually input it through a journal entry, clearly that is not the best process in place. Unfortunately, there are certain things where that's pretty typical. So income tax is one of those areas where a lot of things are done in Excel and then ultimately pushed into a journal entry. Your stock-based compensation activities, even though the data comes from one of the institutions, some of the analysis, some of the assessments have to be done in a way that is somewhat manual and cumbersome, and then they ultimately end up in a journal entry. So you can get data from the cloud, you can get data from an institution that's hosted, and then you still have to manage. What companies are doing these days is they're taking that data and they're creating bots that do a lot of those individual transactions and keystrokes. It sounds a lot like a macro, but it's not. It's very secure, and it ultimately it can learn, actually. So as it makes mistakes and you correct it, it won't make that mistake again, and will learn. In some cases, it starts to take over, and you have to be very careful. But a lot of these manual processes, they're using bots and using AI to ultimately improve and streamline processes. And then the last one is just cost savings. Cost savings is a big one, and it's not just the cost savings of having a hosted on the cloud application, but it's also the ability to outsource and save money that way. And then you've got built-in functionality that stays fairly constant. You're not creating an IT infrastructure behemoth. So there's a lot of cost savings beyond just the cost of the application. It is, being on the cloud actually produces a significant level of cost savings and streamlining that you couldn't really get if you were on-prem. All right. A question did come in, are there any alternative solutions to use if we are hesitant to implementing cloud usage? It depends on what you mean by cloud. So again, if you're thinking about a closed-end system and you're a fairly small operation, you can use a QuickBooks. That is essentially on cloud. It is essentially hosted application. So is that an alternate? No, to me, that's just a lower level of cloud application. But if you're looking to move from an on-prem large system and you are looking to move to the cloud, but you don't have the resources, you don't have the funding, you don't necessarily have the time to do it in year, because that's obviously the most ideal timing. You don't want to really cross a year where your systems are in limbo. You could decide to take on applications. So again, like I said, we went to the AP process first. When established POs, getting the company used to using POs took a long time. There were a lot of people that were just used to just ordering things themselves. They would just call the vendor up and order something, and then an invoice would just show up somewhere, either in their desk or the AP desk, and we didn't know what to do with it. So if you want to take that on first, your first year, you could delay the process. I don't really recommend it, but sometimes I can understand resources aren't there, and it just takes a longer time to get things done. Start there, get that done first. Work on your AP system, get the company used to doing POs. Even if you're creating manual POs, where you're using Excel, even, get them used to producing a PO and send those in through email if you have to. And so get the whole company used to that process first. And then when you install the PO system that's on cloud and ready to go, it's a much easier process. Similar with the order to cash systems, billing can be, in a lot of cases, if you're on these applications, Oracle, SAP, or otherwise, you're still using another system, another process for billing. And so if that order to cash system is embedded in your programs, it's embedded in all of the customer interfaces, there isn't necessarily a reason to change that out, especially if that's already on the cloud. Keep that system. Don't think about buying or embedding or integrating the order to cash application that comes with the ERP. Keep your customer-based operation on that system and then create the integration. The data can come out of there very simply. Of course, the integrations are always, there's always complications there, but you want to have that data. You want to be able to service your customers in a certain way through a certain system that you're used to, especially if it's integrated into your platform programs. Keep that. Don't necessarily change that out right away. Get your financial systems in place. Get your journal entries and account recs under control in a system that's consistent and on the cloud. And then think about all the other applications going forward. Again, I would always do AP first. The PO and AP and vendor management is just fundamental to everything that happens in financial work. Order to cash typically is something that is very difficult to change. So use order to cash the way it is and have both applications integrate into the new ERP. and then you can continue to move and evolve as you go. So it is another way to go, as opposed to doing everything all up front. Order to cash takes a lot of time. In fact, I had in two different instances where you won't go to the cloud, ERP is set up, everything's ready to go, controls, budgets, forecasts, everything was ready to go. We still didn't touch order to cash. You do that after the fact. But in my view, the SOWs come in, and creating POs, fundamental to the process. Journal entries, account recs next. And then you do that in an ERP and then move on to your ledgers later. Another question coming up here. What precautions can organizations take to ensure employees don't share confidential data? Well, every employee has a code and has the ability to access it independently. Anybody that is sharing data that is inappropriate, that isn't part of that other person's job, that they can't access, in some cases, I would say, is tantamount to insubordination, and ultimately, grounds for elimination and termination. You should not be sharing confidential data. Obviously, especially if it's employee data, especially if it's customer data, these things are sacrosanct, and you can't have that. So anybody who's constantly breaking that rule, my view, should be terminated. It creates a huge risk and liability for the company. What role does AI play in regard to cloud, if any? Huge. I'll give you an example. We think about order to cash, and how order to cash is fundamentally not necessarily part of the ERP. It's a separate system where we integrate, but ultimately there are applications there, for instance, cash application, which is not integrated and ultimately is somewhat manual and almost cannot be automated. And so what do? I mean, it's keystrokes, it's looking at a check or a wire or a lockbox receipt, and you're saying, what do I do with this? Sometimes you don't even know what the customer is. And if they give you a customer number, you're not sure what invoice to apply it. And so there is AI that you can purchase. There is intellectual property that can approach some of those very manual processes. There is AI that is used in invoice recognition. So when you have a vendor sending you an invoice and you don't know how to apply that invoice against the PO that came in, you can OCR, you can scan that invoice in, that system learns that particular vendor and where everything is on that invoice, and can detect which invoice applies to which PO. And so there's a lot of application like that, that AI is just perfect. It's not easy, doesn't happen right away. The system has to learn from its mistakes, but AI is a huge part of where everyone's moving to eliminate all those manual processes. Okay. Last polling question. Within your respective organizations, do you currently have a timeline for when to implement cloud-based accounting, if at all? It is currently, and then almost 50% said it is currently implemented and working well. Have a timeline, though. What is your timeline? So a lot of companies are saying half the companies are already on the cloud, but the other half are not. There's a question of when, and then what time of year. So when is at the point in time where you have all the things you need, the resources, the buy-in, the need, and ultimately a sense for kind of which way you want to go. That is the best time. And then when, or the earlier in the year you can do it, the better, so that you can try to get it in before your next audit. And so you don't want to ever really cross an audit period with an implementation. So, at the end of the day, going on the cloud in a lot of ways is what used to happen years ago when companies were deciding to go new on-prem. And, the new systems had better applications, better functionality, more security. There's really a lot of those same benefits that exist with going on cloud, but there's just so much more today. Cybersecurity, global access, and then ultimately, certainly, controls are much more. embedded in the functionality you get when you buy. So ultimately, how do you decide? You have to decide when and if the company is ready for. Where are you in your evolution? Do you have a lot of acquisitions coming? If you're acquiring 4 or 5 companies in the next few months, that is not a good time to install a new application if you don't have a significant number of resources to apply. If your funding is weak, it is not a good time. If the board is dealing with litigation and dealing with a lot of other things happening at the company, you have to be wary about whether or not they're going to be open to a conversation around moving to the cloud. Last question coming in here. Can you make any recommendations for organizations that are struggling to properly budget for new cloud-based accounting solutions? Again, that's everybody. Who's got the money for this? At the end of the day, it's not your product. It is not customer facing in most cases. And then ultimately, everybody's worried and fixated and focused on something else in the company. So there's no great time. And so my recommendation is there's no better time than now. It will never get better than the moment in time you're thinking about it. It'll always be worse sometime later because there'll always be something else going on. So what does that mean? Start early, start your promotional discussions, start with your CFO, with your controller, and start the conversations around how can we get this done, and then engage the treasury team for financing, engage the CFO in terms of controls, and then ultimately getting the board on board to get this done. I think we're approaching the end of the discussion here. This was really a lot of fun. Like as always is thank you for all of your participation. Some of these questions were right on point and excellent. I hope I answered them in the best way that I could. There's another couple of minutes open here. If anybody has any last questions, you can put them in. But otherwise, I'm going to hand this back to Nick and Lindsay to close up the discussion.
Great. Thanks again, David, for such an incredible keynote. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. This officially concludes the Argyle SMB Accounting Forum. Thank you again for joining us today and engaging in our content. Have a great rest of your day.